Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to the shop. And if you're watching this, you are probably the proud owner of a 2004 to 2008 11th gen F-150. And for the most part, these are pretty darn reliable trucks. I've had great luck with mine over 13 years, right about 100,000 miles I've put on it. And from a mechanical standpoint, they're solid trucks. Couple quirks here and there. If you've watched my other video, you've seen the 90-degree sway bar end links are, typical Ford kind of weirdo design that they decide to fix halfway through a vehicle generation, but again, pretty solid overall. Now, if you have a two-wheel drive model truck, you may be aware of what they have from the factory as a sealed one-piece brake rotor, wheel hub assembly, and a wheel bearing. And it's all one piece. You have to replace it all at once. And if you have any part of that fail, you're stuck buying an entire one. And it could be nearly $200 per assembly. Are you screwed? Well, maybe. But I'm gonna show you what I did about 8 or 9 years ago to my truck and give you an overview of the Centric hub conversion kit and give you a little bit of a long-term review and some insight. So stay tuned. So what I got here is this big hunk of metal, and this here is the hub conversion kit from Centric. Now this is actually the OG one that I installed in this truck. This is from the passenger side. It just failed, started failing probably around a month ago. And basically what happens is the wheel bearing started to fail. I don't know if you can see this, it's got a lot of play in there. And so that's obviously no bueno. So I needed to get it fixed. If you're unfamiliar with how to diagnose a bad wheel bearing, it's heavy, I'm gonna put this down. So when a wheel bearing fails, it gets play and whatever, and it starts to make a whirring sound. So I knew when I was turning to the driver's side, I was loading the passenger side. And it would only do it when you're going on a more aggressive turn. You're putting the weight on that side, it's stressing that whole assembly, and that's ultimately how I diagnosed it. Now, this would go back 7 years ago. I had the driver's side fail. That was back in 2013 I put the kit on. 2014 I had a failure. I did read back then, because again, I was big on the forums back then. F-150 Online is the one I always went on. The people were questioning the quality of the wheel bearings. Now, I'll show you. I'm not an expert when it comes to this, but this is pretty disposable, because for the most part, my understanding is this wheel bearing is machined into this hub. The way they design it, it's non-removable. So that means when this fails, because this is honestly the only, I guess unless you broke a stud, but I would imagine you'd be able to get one pressed in. If this wheel bearing fails, you have to replace it. And this costs around I think it was like $83 now on Amazon. So it's not awful, and it's definitely cheaper than replacing brake rotors with the hub and wheel bearing assembly. And I have a really nice power stop brake kit on my truck, and I didn't want to replace that. So this is, despite having a failure on each side, I actually am okay with it because it let me keep the rest of my brakes alone, and I just had to pull off the bracket for the caliper and the caliper, pull off the brake rotor, and then zip off the spindle nut. And the spindle nut is the next part I want to talk about. This is a Ford part, so you do need to buy this when you do either side. It is a one-time use, and if you don't believe me, it literally says, do not reuse. There are people that have said this is a money grab. I have mechanic friends that have said this, but guess what? It's maybe $18 or $19 for this stupid thing, but that is the only thing that is holding that hub onto the spindle, and I'm not gonna bet my life on a freaking $18, $19 nut. So I'll bend over, throw me a jar of Vaseline, and I'll gladly buy one of these, because it is not worth dealing with this. You're probably not going to be removing this nut. So when you put that kit on, the only time you really should be taking it off is if you do a kind of a low-key modification, like, or an uncommon, I mean, like myself, where I put Bell-Tech drop spindles on a few years ago, so I replaced it. Other than that, it's if a hub fails, which hopefully is not very frequent. So if you just buy this hub assembly and this nut, you're looking over, at least with tax, I think I paid around $110 here recently. Now, if you go with just the hubs, it gives you the option at that point to choose whatever rotors you want. Now, when I first bought this kit back in 2013, I elected to go with their actual all-encompassing kit, which I don't know if they still sell anymore. I can certainly check and put part numbers down below. But what that was Centric blank rotors, you know, non-drilled, non-slotted, none of that. And Centric makes nice brake components, and it came with a rotor for each side, and then a hub for each side, and then from Ford, which I just get on Amazon, I just get the hub, so the spindle nut, so you get two of these. You have to buy two, and as always with anything like this, make sure you have some extra cotter pins on hand, because you want to make sure you have a cotter pin that's locking this spindle in so it can't back out. But other than that, they're pretty easy to install. So no matter if you decide to go with the Centric conversion or you stick with the OEM style, you know, one-piece hub bearing assembly, I got a couple of tips that you might find helpful. So the spindle nut that we've talked about a few times now, it's 36 millimeters. So what I got is a 36 millimeter half drive socket. I got this years ago. I think it was from Advanced Auto. You just kind of have to look around for it. Just make sure you have this before you start the job. In terms of torquing it, it goes to 295 foot-pounds, which you're going to hear that and go, holy crap, it's a lot. Just like the lower control arms for the, on the lower control arm, the lower shock bolt is like 351. There's a couple of big torque values in the front end. What I have is I had picked this 3/4 inch drive torque wrench. This goes up to 300 foot-pounds. I got this years ago from Harbor Freight. Came with a certificate of calibration. I think it was within 2 or 3%. I use that as much as I possibly can. I have used it, obviously, to do this very job. Admittedly, I have also used my impact that only goes up to 300 foot-pounds. And I know it's very close because I've torqued this to the spindle nut to 300, and I've barely been able to get it off using the impact. So it is really, really close. So I feel comfortable doing with either. And then just remember, when you take the original spindle nut off, make sure you save the crowned retainer. That's going to be something similar to like when you've done tie rod ends or anything like that. So it basically slides over the top, and then you just got to remember to put a cotter pin in, and then just make sure you fan the edges out, just like what should have been installed. But in case someone worked on your truck before, you know, whether you bought it used or whatever, you do want to make sure that that stuff's on there, because that's what's going to protect this from coming off. Because don't forget, this is the only thing that is holding the hub on, which means that's what's holding your wheel on. So it's really, really important that you get this tight and you put that cotter pin in. Now, despite having 2 failures over the course of the past 8 or 9 years since I put this kit on, I still would recommend it. And I say that because when you add up the cost of replacing an entire rotor and wheel bearing assembly, they can get pretty pricey, especially if you go with what I believe is a name brand. They can easily, it could run you quite a few $100s to do both sides. And then the other thing is, say you had one of those wheel bearings go, well, it affects your rotor too, because unless you have a way to press in and out a bearing, you're going to have to replace the whole assembly, which means now you really ought to think about replacing both sides of the vehicle, because you typically want to do brake stuff in pairs. So by doing this, you're able to use the 4-wheel drive model rotors, and if one by chance goes bad, like it has for me, I'm able to just simply swap the hub out and keep my existing brake rotors in, because they're perfectly fine. So it's something to think about. Again, I understand why some people choose to do this and others choose not to, but I have to say, in the 40 to 50,000 miles that I've ran it, having the 2 failures, it's really not a big deal to me, especially seeing as you're able to keep your brake rotors and your brake, setup left alone and simply just change the hub if there's a problem. As always, guys, thanks for watching. If you have any questions or anything, absolutely let me know. I'm happy to help any way I can. I love sharing information with you guys. So we'll see you in the next one. Take care.